Hello and good morning. I'm pleased to welcome the Honourable Professor Gareth Evans to the Global Ideas Initiative for a session entitled The Norm Architect, Gareth Evans and the Making of R2P. A distinguished statesman, a scholar of renown, and a globally respected voice, Professor Evans, or as he likes to be called, Gareth, has notably served as Foreign Minister of Australia and as President of the International Crisis Group, devoting much of his public life to ensuring that the promise of never again matters. In 2001, following the horrors of, respectively, Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, Professor Evans was asked to co-chair the Canadian-sponsored International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. The Commission was tasked with examining the historical barriers to humanitarian intervention, focusing on the following question: what responsibility does the international community bear when states, both unable or unwilling, to protect their own people from mass atrocity crimes, the likes of genocide? The answer it proposed, the responsibility to protect, sought to forge a new consensus beyond the sovereignty dilemma, challenging the view that sovereignty and non-intervention should prevail where states fail to protect their own people. Gareth would spend the years that followed advancing R2P through his wise leadership of the International Crisis Group, an organization that he would lead for nearly a decade, helping build international support for the norm that culminated in its endorsement by the United Nations General Assembly in 2005 and its reaffirmation by the Security Council in 2006. In my archival research at the United Nations, I came across a remark by the Secretary General, the late Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, that I think captures Gareth's lifelong service to atrocity prevention. Speaking of Evans and the International Crisis Group, Annan highlighted, together in a remarkably short time, you have made the International Crisis Group a global voice of consciousness and a genuine force for peace. And you have challenged all states to live up to what Gareth has taught us to call their responsibility to protect. Professor Evans, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
My pleasure, Martin.
Delighted. Let's begin, I think, with the personal origins and the antecedents before turning our attention to the Commission and the formal emergence of R2P. And I would like to begin with the experiences that first brought the issue of genocide and mass atrocities to your attention. In my reading of your work, and you're certainly a prolific author, this seems important because R2P is not itself a philosophical or theoretical exposition. It emerged, I think, from a much deeper failure, political failure, that is the inability of the international community to protect populations from crimes that have been allowed to happen. And with that, my questions to you is, when and how did the issue of genocide and other atrocity crimes first capture your own attention and commitment? Was it after you were Australia's foreign minister, or was it much earlier? And at what point did it become clear that a radical new thinking, as proposed by the responsibility to protect, would be necessary to end the horrors of crimes against humanity and other mass atrocity crimes?
Well, thank you again, Marlo, for your generous introduction, and it's a great pleasure to join you in this event. Growing up as I did in the 1950s and 1960s, of course, I was conscious of the World War II Holocaust, not least because of the number of Jewish friends I had among my classmates at both school and university. And the Anne Frank diary was a huge source of wake-up awareness to many of us about the horrors of the Holocaust. But I was less conscious, I have to say, of the fate of scores of millions of other people killed during the course of the 20th century, going back to the Armenian genocide of World War I, the Soviet atrocities of the 1930s, not least the Holodomor, as it's now known, the Ukrainian famine that was generated by Stalin against Ukrainians. There was the horrors perpetrated in various ways in Mao's China. There was the horrors of the politicide of the purge of of communists by Suharto's Indonesia in the 1960s. But none of this stuff really made a huge impact on me growing up. What did make a difference was my experience going to Cambodia. Visiting there as a part of a backpacking odyssey from Australia to study in England. I spent a lot of time in a lot of different Southeast Asian locations, catching up with my own student cohort, drinking beer and eating noodles, and in the case of Cambodia, driving in a share taxi up dusty roads to Siem Reap and Angkor Wat, scattering pigs and chickens and children along the way. And it was a memorable experience, as it had been in so many other Southeast Asian capitals of the time. In later years, professionally and otherwise, I kept on running into students of that cohort that I'd met during those travels. But I never ever met anyone that I'd met in Cambodia. And of course, the reason for that, it came to strike me just with a sort of a hammer blow, was the 1975 Khmer Rouge genocide, which killed something like 2 million Cambodians, had meant the death through malnutrition, starvation, overwork, illness, or outright execution of middle-class enemies of the state, of every one of those kids that I had come to know. And that just brought it home to me in a very graphic and very personal way, just what the reality of mass atrocity crimes was. As Foreign Minister, as I was of Australia from 1988 to 1996, I was confronted very professionally and very immediately by the atrocity crime horror again when you'll all remember be aware, the Rwandan situation exploded in a horrific genocide of Hutus, of Tutsis by Hutus in 1994, killing something like 800,000 people, being butchered just in a couple of months. And felt totally impotent. The United Nations Security Council was paralyzed. I tried to interest when I became aware of what was going on, reported from New York, tried to get our Defense Department to send some peacekeepers there, but whatever we were able to do was too little too late. We lost the opportunity to make any kind of difference. And then again, we all witnessed, and I witnessed as Foreign Minister, the horror of the Srebrenica massacre in 1995, just a year later, when 8,000 young men and boys were taken out from under the noses of UN troops in Bosnia and executed in nearby killing fields. It became clear to me then that really just there was a desperate need for new thinking and new action internationally in response to this problem, this issue, this catastrophe of atrocity crime perpetration. There was simply no international consensus of any kind then as to how to react to these situations, either preventively or after the event. Even with the passage of the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Convention amendments, and all the rest of the stuff that was done after World War II, there was no international sense of obligation to act in these situations. Far greater attention was paid to the prohibition against waging aggressive war. That captured everybody's attention. But far more, it was just the salience of that provision in the Charter, which, indicated that it was inappropriate to intervene in the domestic affairs of other member states. Begging the question as to what was a domestic affair, of course. But that was the prevailing sentiment. In the global north, there was this willingness to talk the talk about humanitarian intervention. Bernard Kouchner of Médecins Sans Frontières, the French NGO, had articulated the case for humanitarian intervention, military intervention in these situations, very articulately, very well. And the global north did tend to talk the talk about humanitarian intervention, but it didn't walk the walk in any of the cases that really mattered. When it finally got around to doing so in Kosovo in 1999, that stimulated really a storm of protest among many other players around the world, because that was done without any pretense of going to the Security Council to seek authorization. So, from the Global South perspective, even though there was a lot of unhappiness about atrocities that were occurring in southern state territories, there was an absolute unwillingness to accept any concept of the right to intervene, any concept of military intervention by the great powers with the capacity to militarily so act. The Global South countries in question were all very recent in their acquisition of sovereign independence. They felt pretty fragile still as entities. They're all too conscious of the role that the imperial overlords in the past had played in their so-called civilizing missions. And they were just utterly unwilling to concede any right of intervention, and humanitarian intervention was deeply unpalatable to them. So we had this complete division of sort of approach from the global north to global south, with nobody doing anything very much consensus-free zone. There were some conceptual attempts made to change the global debate, to get some action moving. Now, Tony Blair went on the record to talk about our common community, and he didn't articulate it very clearly, and it was only to do with reaction again after the event rather than anything that was remotely preventive in character. Sadako Agata, very famous, introduced the concept of human security, which was very people-centered rather than state-centered. But that again had no great traction in this instance because it didn't have any particular operational focus that was immediately relevant to atrocity crime situations. Kofi Annan himself, who you've kindly mentioned, did introduce the concept of there was a tension between state sovereignty and individual sovereignty. But when you explored that, it was really just restating the problem rather than coming up with any very helpful solution. What was a helpful contribution to the debate and what fed into the later report of the Commission, which we'll no doubt come to in a second, was the work of Francis Deng and his colleague Roberta Cohen at the Brookings Institution, when he, particularly from his focal point of focus as very conscious of the role of internally displaced people, he introduced the very important notion of sovereignty as responsibility, that sovereign nations did have a responsibility to their own people. And we were able to sort of apply that in this context later on. What that didn't do was address in any way the responsibility of states towards other states that were misbehaving in this respect, and that was still a big gap in the conceptual thinking. But that's where we were, before the events that we're now going to talk about took place, the rethinking and the reactivation of a whole new approach to dealing with atrocity crimes.
Indeed, yes. And I think that sets us up nicely to actually look at the Commission itself and some of its contributions in changing the thinking, particularly the three pillars. And you've spoken eloquently about how the concept was actually born, but in many ways, and many R2P scholars that have, retrospectively written about the norm, is that it wasn't, as you noted, a significant departure. It built on this long evolutionary pedigree, such as the work, as you noted, of Francis Deng and Rebecca Cohen, who I've closely looked at. Would you kindly speak to the commission itself, the process, the consultations, both national and regional, that ultimately culminated in the report?
Well, the birth of responsibility to protect was, as I've written elsewhere, really a play in three acts, of which
Yes,
the
indeed.
commission exercise was just the first act. It was followed, secondly, by the work of the high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change, which fed into the 2005 World Summit. And then there were the proceedings of the summit itself and all the diplomacy that went with it. So I'll need to say a word about each of those three stages in order to explain how we got to where we did in 2005. The commission, the Canadian-sponsored commission, was a response to a challenge that was very explicitly laid down by Kofi Annan in his Millennium 2000 address to the UN when he said, and I quote, "If humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we then respond to a Rwanda, to a Srebrenica, to gross and systematic violations of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity?" That was the challenge. Canada rose to it, appointed this commission with me as co-chair, along with a fabulously distinguished African colleague, Mohammed Sarnoon, and with a bit of a dream cast of other colleagues. I mean, from the global north, there was Lee Hamilton from the United States. There was Klaus Naumann, a German general. There was Michael Ignatieff from Canada. From the global south, there was, among others, Fidel Ramos from the Philippines, Cyril Ramaphosa, now President of Prime Minister of South Africa, and a very big figure then in the anti-apartheid movement. There was Cornelio Sommaruga, the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who was delighted with my description of him at the time as being a northerner with southern characteristics. And there was a Russian, Vladimir Lukin, who carried a fair bit of clout in that part of the world. The product that we produced was the result of a really very intense process over a full year from September 2000 to December 2001 involving 5 full meetings of the commission, and plus, as I look back at the record, 11 regional and national consultations spread across all 5 continents. And we produced in that period a 70-page report and a 400-page supplementary volume of research materials. But what was important about that report, I think, was that it broke new ground in 4 different ways, and they're really worth remembering. The first was to change the language of the debate. We moved from the right to intervene, which was incredibly neuralgic, as I've described, in the global south, to the responsibility to protect, which was much more neutral and indeed much more inherently attractive. The importance of language came home to me vividly, I think, when I thought of the role that Guru Brundtland's very path-breaking commission report on sustainable development had in moving the environmental cause forward. Until that report, there'd been a huge gulf between the greenies on the one hand and the mad dog developers on the other, no common ground at all. But talking about sustainable development gave them a conceptual common ground on which to find a cooperative way forward. And that was very much the case with the responsibility to protect. It was a concept that immediately seemed attractive, immediately had none of the downside neuralgia associated with humanitarian intervention or the right to intervene. Secondly, what we did was we broadened the range of the actors in focus, whereas humanitarian intervention focused entirely on the big military guys capable of throwing their military weight around. What we said was that atrocity prevention and response is a much wider range of responsibility than that. It's the responsibility of the state itself, it's the responsibility of others to assist states, and it's a much wider community of states that we want involved in any reaction to adverse events, not just the big guys going in with guns blazing. The third big thing we did was to broaden the range of responses, again, away from the military one. We moved from just focusing on reaction to a big focus on prevention. And within the spectrum of reactive responses, we moved the focus right away from the responsibility. So we moved the focus right away from just military stuff to other forms of robust response, whether it's diplomatic naming and shaming and isolation, or whether it's economic sanctions, or whether it was action in the emerging jurisdictions of the international criminal courts. These were all remedies, all parts of the toolbox that we identified. And this was a very different territory from the much more limited territory occupied by humanitarian intervention. And then there was the final thing that we did. We spent a lot of time focusing on the criteria for military action. If you did require military action in a really extreme, really ugly situation, what were the conditions that had to be satisfied? Well, we said there was a legal condition had to be satisfied, namely Security Council approval, but there also had to be some prudential criteria identified, which we did. I think 4 of them: the seriousness of the harm involved, the question of last resort, whether other forms of remedy were potentially available, or was only the military one that could possibly make a difference. There was the question of proportionality, that any response be appropriately proportional to the nature of the violation that's occurring. There was the question of intent, right intent. Are you going in there to, protect your banana industry, or are you going in there to genuinely save lives? That was a relevant consideration. And there was finally, crucially, the question of balance of consequences, the notion that if you were going to contemplate military action, you had to be absolutely sure that it would do more good than harm. So they were the achievements of the commission, and as you'll appreciate, there's a lot of conceptual value that went
Indeed.
into those discussions from people like Francis Deng and the concept of sovereignty as responsibility. But the commission definitely broadened it out much more much more widely, as I've indicated, and the whole concept, uh, as it emerged, was one that really did make a serious conceptual difference. Now, of course, since we produced our report in December 2001, just after the events of 9/11,
Indeed.
uh, it was a very, very difficult environment to get traction for actual change, because the shift of global debate moved away from atrocity response, which had been very prominent in the previous 5 or 6 years as a result of events in the Balkans and Africa. It moved, of course, to counter-terrorism and everything associated with it. So it was really, really hard work to get this thing off the shelves and into the minds of the relevant policymakers. The second act in the process was a critical one. This was the transmission mechanism that moved it off the dusty shelf into the mainstream political debate. And this was Kofi Annan's Secretary General's high-level panel that I refer to. Again, another cast made in heaven. Guru Brundtland was a member. Sadako Agata was a member of it. Who else? David Hannay, the British Lord, former very distinguished British diplomat in the UN, Brent Scowcroft, the very, very high level national security advisor of the United States, um, and among others, Chen Chi-chen, the former Chinese foreign minister and vice minister, who'd been a close colleague of mine when I was foreign minister. And his approval of the whole process was, as I'll mention, pretty critical. What emerged from the high-level panel report, which was created in order to advise the Secretary General on what recommendations to take forward to the
Indeed.
2005 World Summit, which was the 60th anniversary of the UN, which brought together over 150 heads of state and government to look at fundamental reforms of all sorts of aspects of the international system. So the report of our panel fed into Kofi Annan's recommendations, and his recommendations included very prominently support for responsibility protect. I happen to be a member of that panel fortuitously. I think if I hadn't been, it may have had less attention there than would otherwise uh, have derived such of the happenstance things about international diplomacy. But for whatever reason, we got the recommendation up, and it was recommended to Kofi Annan that there be support for the collective responsibility to protect, um, with Security Council appropriate engagement in on the occasion of large-scale genocide, ethnic cleansing, other crimes against humanity occurring when sovereign governments have proved powerless or unwilling to act. Very clearly articulated recommendation. And then when we got to which only got through the group, I guess, on a consensual basis, because our Chinese colleague, who might have been expected to be pretty cautious about this, in fact, just waved it through. And it remains a little bit of a mystery to this day whether that was a deliberately conscious decision on his part, or whether he would just, he was rather advanced age at that stage, and whether he just sort of lost the plot. I think he knew what was going on and made it his business to ensure that China wasn't seen as blocking this important step. And that's part of the whole history of this, which will be forever, I guess, debated. When we get to the World Summit in 2005, do you want me to tell you the story
Yes,
of
of
that now?
course. Yes, yes, please.
Well, as I said, this was a huge event, long in the preparation, involving over 150 heads of state and government, addressing the whole range of international issues. And it was remarkable for its absence of consensus on almost anything. It was a very limited set of agreements that finally emerged from that summit. But extraordinarily, Responsibility Protect was one of them. It was not without contest along the way from all sorts of people, Russia and a whole bunch of other states in the global south that were seeing this as no more than the old humanitarian intervention wine in some kind of new bottle. But nonetheless, we did eventually get there, and we got there as a result of some. I mean, I was only a very bit player of this, as you mentioned. I was head of the International Crisis Group at the time, and certainly very active in all my own representations around the place and trying to move the game forward. But the crucial roles were really played by the players themselves in New York. Some really critical diplomats, the head of the Australian mission, a guy called John Douth. The Canadians, of course, were very active, including at the prime ministerial level. But what really made the difference in an environment where there wasn't much broad enthusiasm from most of the Asian countries, what really made a difference was the Latin Americans were by and large wholly supportive, with the exception of Venezuela and Cuba and some of the other players up there who were habitual spoilers. Latin Americans, the major countries, broadly supportive, but in particular the sub-Saharan Africans, led by South Africa, and they were incredibly. The African Union had itself, just a couple of years earlier, embraced the concept of intervention in situations of, crimes against humanity, atrocity crimes in terms of its own members, and was very keen on this concept being embraced more universally. So one way or the other, we got there, and it was an extraordinary result when we did, given that so much else was a blank slate emerging from that summit. The resolutions in the famous outcome documents,
Yes.
paragraphs 138, 139, almost incomprehensible to read. It's a real word salad. It's a scrambled eggs. It's a dog's breakfast, whichever metaphor you prefer. The language was the classic bureaucratic language that emerges from a multilateral negotiation, where everybody has an input, and there's no real stylist at work holding it all together. What made, but nonetheless, the core elements were nonetheless, pretty clear, albeit buried away in a lot of verbiage. And just a little bit later, when the Secretary General's Special Advisor, Ed Luck, on Responsibility Protect, drafted a report for him on the implementation of R2P a year or two later, it was articulated in terms of three pillars, the language of the outcome document. And that three-pillar language was, brilliantly clear in its articulation and has stayed with us since. And in a nutshell, pillar one was the responsibility of every state to protect its own peoples from mass atrocity crimes, whether perpetrated by the state itself or by other players within the state system. Secondly, it was second pillar, it's the responsibility of the wider international community to assist, if it possibly can, other states to build their capacity to deal with atrocity crime issues and to assist them to meet any challenges that might arise in that respect. So responsibility to your own people, responsibility to assist others, and then the crunch in pillar three, the responsibility of the wider global community to act if a state is manifestly failing to protect its own people, to act in a timely and decisive manner with such measures as are necessary to meet the situation, including, and it's quite specific, including with the appropriate authorization from the UN Security Council, the use of military force. So, but not confined to military force, just including military force. But those three pillars have become the story of R2P ever since. It was pretty extraordinary achievement to get this resolution unanimously embraced, as it finally was, by that World Summit, and then in turn formally adopted by the UN General Assembly. The British historian, the biographer of Winston Churchill, Martin Gilbert, famously described this resolution a couple of years later as as I quote him, the most significant adjustment to sovereignty in 360 years. He's referring to the Treaty of Westphalia back in 1648. Well, that's a big stretch, that's a big call, but we were pretty happy, those of us who were advocating for R2P, to have it embraced in this way. But of course, words on paper are one thing, implementation in practice is something else, and no doubt that's what you'll now want to come to.
Indeed, yes. And I think you rightly highlighted that 2005 was certainly a turning point for the norm's not only emergence, but its diffusion within international public policy thinking. Looking ahead from 2005 onwards, what has been the experience with R2P? Has it done anything to change the world and specifically state behavior when it comes to reducing the impact and ultimately eliminating mass atrocity crimes? And perhaps more saliently, um, what is the most persistent, you would say, misunderstanding about the norm that certainly emerged, I would say, immediately after the outcome summit with the contestations the norm was subject to by member states and other entities and individuals as a whole?
Okay, well, R2P is now, as you say, 20 years old
Indeed.
since its formal introduction. And when we look at how things have turned out and gone wrong in so many ways, and atrocities have continued to be perpetrated in so many places, whether it's Syria or Sri Lanka or Myanmar or Sudan or the Congo or Ukraine, or of course now Gaza or elsewhere, it's easy to understand that R2P does have many cynics and many skeptics saying that the whole thing has been a waste of time, a dead letter. But while its achievements have not, of course, met our expectations in the hardest of cases, and there's been many of those I've just identified, the key ones we all know about, R2P still does command a quite extraordinary degree of acceptance under and it has achieved quite a few things over those 20 years. From the outset, I always argued there were four benchmarks against which the success or otherwise of R2P would need to be measured. The first was its success in establishing itself as a new norm, its normative force. Secondly, its success or otherwise in being a catalyst for institutional change. Thirdly, its success in being an effective mechanism for atrocity prevention. And fourthly, its success or otherwise in being an effective mechanism for atrocity response when prevention had manifestly failed. If you work your way through each of those benchmarks, the story is not nearly as black as some people still want to paint it. The normative dimension of R2P, I think, is really pretty clear. It does command, as I just said, a quite extraordinary degree of acceptance, which would be unthinkable now, or to this day,
Indeed.
for humanitarian intervention or any variation on all the right to intervene theme. It does have traction. It's part of the traction. The evidence for it is the language of the annual UN General Assembly debates that have been taking place since 2009, where there's only a very small group of countries continue to rail against the whole concept. Everybody else accepts it in principle. They may only be paying lip service to it, sure, but nonetheless, they nonetheless accept it in principle. They acknowledge its normative force. And of course, when you look at the Security Council itself, um, responsibility to protect language has been adopted at last count, and I checked as of today, it's 99 resolutions of the Security Council specifically refer to responsibility to protect. And there's, in addition to that, another 17 presidential statements referring to it. True it is that most of those refer only to the first pillar of R2P, the responsibility of a state to protect its own people. And many resolutions have referred to particular countries, failed to meet that standard of behavior towards its own people. There's been much less enthusiasm for any action at all under Pillar 3. I'm not just talking about military action, I'm talking about any form of coercive action, sanctions, or criminal court references and so on, because people do regard that as much more sensitive as it is. But nonetheless, at a normative level, and that's what we're talking about first up, I think you have to say that it has real traction. Secondly, it has been a catalyst, I think, for significant institutional change. Many states have, over the years, developed both civil and military capacity to deal with atrocity response situations elsewhere in which they might become engaged or in which they think they have some responsibility to engage as part of the assistance criteria and so on in the responsibility to protect World Summit formulation. Um, a number of countries have identified, have become members of the Friends of R2P group, Responsibility to Protect group, in New York and Geneva, United Nations settings. At last count, I think there were over 61 countries that had established focal points physically within their own bureaucratic systems to identify emerging atrocity crime situations and to articulate and energize a response by their own governments to that. Again, you can say that a lot of that stuff has been honoured more in the the non-observance than the observance, that it's just paying lip service. Yes, there's some truth in that. But if you're looking at, the runs on the board, there is a level of engagement, of institutional engagement, which was completely lacking in predecessor concepts and periods. And I think R2P can claim some credit for that. When it comes to effective prevention, of course, the great thing about prevention, as all of us know in this business, that when you succeed, nothing happens, and therefore nobody notices. So prevention's always a tricky one to hang your hat on, the successful statistics there. But I've articulated elsewhere a number of success stories, especially in Africa, Kenya, in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Gambia. Uh, Burundi is another classic example. It's got, as most people are aware, almost exactly the same demographic makeup as next door Rwanda, and has been for decades on the sort of edge of an explosive volcano for the same sorts of ethnic tension reasons that have been so catastrophic in its next door neighbour Rwanda. But over and over again, it's remained part of the situations with which the Security Council has remained seized, and every time that volcano has looked like exploding, again, there's been some sort of diplomatic effort made to cool things down, and I think Responsibility to Protect R2P can claim the credit for that. When, however, it comes to the fourth benchmark, as a framework, has it been an effective framework for reactive responses? Here, the story is much more mixed. There's a few successful examples in the early days in Kenya and elsewhere, and a very successful intervention, actually a military intervention in Libya initially in 2011, when, as people will remember, Gaddafi was threatening to march upon Benghazi, and there was a widespread expectation that there'd be a major massacre, tens of thousands of people, if that march on Benghazi was allowed to succeed. The Security Council agreed without dissent to a military response after initial ultimatums were given to Gaddafi, which he ignored, and it was initially very successful in stopping that. What went wrong, and a lot did go wrong, unfortunately, with Libya, is that the big Security Council and military players that had undertaken that intervention decided not to stop there, but to go for full-scale regime change, which simply did not have the same degree of support elsewhere on the Security Council, and was regarded, and certainly has been regarded by me ever since, as an act of supreme arrogance on the part of the P3, which was desperately counterproductive to the R2P cause. Because just as the latter stages of the Libya affair were unfolding and this regime change exercise was going on, the situation in Syria started to explode. And it was a classic case for exactly the same kind of, at least condemnatory response by the Security Council. The military situation was very different. But the Security Council couldn't bring itself even to agree about that, on the basis that, look what happened when we did agree to something going on in Libya. If we agree even just to sort of slap on the wrist over Syria, who's to say it will stop there, that the initiative will be taken to go much further than we're willing to go? So from then on, and the collapse of consensus in the Security Council, which is attributable to that misstep in 2011, has been pretty serious, and we now no longer seem to find it possible at a Security Council level, with Russia and China being utterly willing to exercise their vetoes over and over again, and the United States, particularly under its Trumpian incarnation, being utterly indifferent or unwilling to take seriously any kind of responsibility in these situations. We've got the situation where the Security Council is no help at all. So that's a problem. I mean, part of the problem, as you intimated, I think, in your question, is that there's still a disposition to say that R2P is only about military action. It is just the old humanitarian intervention in old wine in some kind of sexed up new bottle. But absolutely, that's not the case, as I've tried to explain at probably nauseous length. It has many other dimensions to it, and many of those other dimensions have been quite successfully invoked. So, but you do have to acknowledge, as you look around and review the record as it stands after 20 years, that the most you can really say about R2P is that for all its successes, it really does remain work in progress when it comes to being a really effective mechanism for energizing an international response to really serious atrocity crime situations.
Indeed, and I think you've highlighted in your most recent publication that it remains the most politically and morally um, significant, given the agreement by the international community in 2005. Now, I'd like to turn our attention to the future of the responsibility to protect. The world in which it now operates is different and entirely different than the one it was endorsed. We're seeing certainly the resurgence of power politics. We're seeing the contempt for international law, but beyond that, the blatant disregard for rules, norms, and principles that have for nearly more than 80 years bound the international community. And above all, I think we're seeing the weakening of multilateral institutions by the great powers themselves. Um,
Hmm.
as the realpolitik really takes precedence. And yet the alternative, it seems, is, the disregard for the protection of populations simply for the sake of power and interest. With the world as it is now, do you have optimism? You're known as an incorrigible optimist, as your memoir title states, that R2P can gain traction. What are some of the strategies and advocacy, and at what levels could that make a difference? And looking ahead, where do you see the path forward for atrocity prevention and international cooperation?
Well, you're right that my incorrigible optimism has been under somewhat of a siege in recent years as a result of the events that you've just summarised, the realities just summarised. But I do believe that R2P has a future where it will be in future more obviously effective in preventing and responding to the hardest of cases. But that's going to require an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of a number of different levels if we're going to get there. Um, Standing back a bit, I think there are three important sources of momentum for if you're going to make any major change internationally or domestically. There's top-down, there's sideways pressure, peer group pressure, and there's bottom-up pressure. Well, if you look at the top-down environment internationally when it comes to R2P, if that means leadership from the UN Security Council, well, that's a very big ask at the moment with the United States, Russia, and China acting as they now are. But I think it is important to remember that none of them have been in the past overtly hostile to R2P. Russia overcame its initial objections and, in fact, went so far as to invoke R2P, God help us, to justify, implausibly, but nonetheless it used it, to justify its initial invasion of Georgia and Ukraine, as claiming to be acting to protect Russian-speaking and Russian ethnic populations at risk. China has, for all its preoccupation with non-interference in other people's internal affairs, has never been an overtly hostile opponent of R2P, and of course, the United States in more attractive times was a significant supporter of R2P, even if it didn't much like accepting any obligations and that would interfere with the divine right of ad hocery with which we associate the US administration in all its incarnations, but that's another story. So look, top down is going to be difficult. There is support in the Security Council from France for R2P still, and France has been a very significant player in advocating and building quite a lot of international support for the concept of non-exercise of the veto in atrocity crime cases. And UK, of course, is a reasonably reliable supporter also. But it's hard work top down. Sideways is more potentially productive. Peer group pressure can be very important domestically, internationally. And there's plenty of examples of middle powers moving the international dial forward in other contexts. There is a strong body of support within the UN system among states generally for R2P, as shown, as I've already mentioned, in General Assembly debates, in membership of the Friends Group, in the establishment of focal groups. 100 plus countries have signed on to, as I just mentioned, the French veto restraint proposal. And I think the important new focus on middle power agency that Prime Minister Mark Carney has given with his famous Davos speech in January, I think is clearly focused on the middle power role in advancing regional and global public goods. And preventing and responding effectively to mass atrocity crimes is a pretty clear example of, such public goods. So I retain some hope that as the new dynamic internationally works itself out, that the middle powers and countries like Canada and Australia and a whole bunch of others of the European Union and elsewhere will again put their shoulder to the wheel to try and generate some effective response in this space. Bottom up remains a terribly important source of momentum for any major change, and committed civil society support for R2P really, I think, is very important to sustain. Government decision makers do tend to get off their tails. I know as a cabinet minister for 13 years, when you get passionate community voices making clear and articulate cases for decent outcomes, there is really a willingness, I think, by most policymakers, decision makers, to take those representations seriously. So the message, I think, for civil society activists here when it comes to R2P is, the old Joe Hill story, which some of your generation may or may not remember. Don't mourn for me, organise. That's the storyline I think is important. R2P, because R2P, among other things, still has the capacity, I think, to capture the imagination of young people. And that's one of the things that gives me, great confidence about the future. There's constant feedback I get from university courses in international relations, which are teaching R2P, as many of them are around the world. And God help me, the number of requests I get for people to help with their theses. Please, this is not an invitation to anybody to do that. I've run out of energy for that kind of activity. But it is encouraging to have the sense that this is something which can capture the imagination of young people and capture the imagination of decent people worldwide. Just finally, on the sort of advocacy strategies that really do need to be embraced, whether you're talking about sideways pressure from middle powers in the international space, whether you're talking about civil society pressure internationally or domestically on their own governments, there are a number of things that I would want to sort of emphasize as being important, as being necessary. The first thing is to make absolutely clear, and I think you foreshadowed this, that there's no obvious alternative conceptual approach to responsibility to protect. And we should be asking the question in these terms. If R2P is not the right set of standard setting principles and prescriptions to guide the international community in its response to unconscionable mass atrocity crimes, to gross and systematic violations of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity, in Kofi Annan's word, if it's not that, what is? What is the alternative? Is there another set of principles anyone can identify using different terminology or concepts addressing both prevention and reaction, which is remotely capable of finding common ground between the global north and the global south in the way that R2P successfully did in 2005 and continues to largely do, at least in principle? Do we abandon altogether the search for some common energizing normative foundation for our response to mass atrocity crimes? Do we put all our focus just on development assistance and institution building and humanitarian relief, as some people want to do. Look, the issue is bigger than that. There is no alternative to R2P, so get behind it. That's advocacy message number one. Advocacy message number two from me is make absolutely clear that R2P is about much more than military intervention in the most extreme cases. Yes, it is about that in extreme cases, and yes, we need to do more work on criteria and so on. Yes, we always need to consider very, very carefully the downside risks of any military adventurism, sure. But we should make absolutely clear it's not about that, and we should emphasize, acknowledge the successes as well as the manifest failures of R2P. I think a third thing that's very important is for advocates to articulate how it's in every country's own national interest to respond decently to conscience-shocking atrocity crimes occurring elsewhere. It's the soft power, it's the reputational return that flows from what I've been describing for years, not that anyone's been taking much notice of it, what I've been describing as being seen to be a good international citizen. It's always seemed to me that's a very important national interest in its own right, that's quite distinct from every country's national interest in its own security and economic prosperity. It's the reputational interest in being seen to be a decent country. And I think that story needs to be told to help keep R2P alive and well. And my final message for advocates is, above all, stay optimistic. Here as elsewhere, if you want to change the world for the better, you have to start by believing in the possibility of change. Never stop working to make that change happen. Optimism is self-reinforcing, just as pessimism is self-defeating. The concept of R2P has shown itself capable of capturing genuine cross-cultural repulsion at the kind of atrocities which did kill some 80 million people during the course of the last century, and doing so in language which for most people is instinctively attractive. It's shown itself capable of creating consensus where none previously existed. So I guess my last word, Milo, is that it really would be a tragedy now to succumb to the cynics and the skeptics, to fail to see the continuing force of R2P as an energizing ideal, and to abandon the aspiration to achieve full and effective implementation of R2P in all its dimensions. So thank you for the opportunity to join you. I'm happy to take some questions if that's what you now want to move to.